Hello, my name is Cody Stidham, and this is my presentation about term limits and the criticisms of them in the United States. You may be asking yourself, what are term limits? Term limits are a set of legal restrictions on the length of time an elected official may hold office. Term limit laws affect how many terms and how many years an individual may hold a specific office. Term limits laws may bar a termed out official from holding office for life, or may set a time frame for which someone may sit out before running for the same office again. This is a definition from Lemuel. Term limits are used to balance how long someone could be in a position of power in the government. Term limits are used to avoid one person from ruling a nation, and it forces diversity in the government with how people in positions will constantly be swapped out over the course of time. Term limits are used to be more in line with a democratic nation. Now, how do term limits, what kind of term limits does the United States have? What branches of government have term limits? The United States doesn't have many term limits in its federal government. Of the three branches of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, only the executive branch of the federal government has term limits, and that's only for the president. No other branch of government has term limits. Congress and Senate members are allowed to be in office as many times as they are voted into them. And the Supreme Court justices are picked by the president, and they are in the Supreme Court until they retire or pass away. How did term limits form in the United States? Term limits, for a long time, weren't really a legal rule, but more like an agreement among the presidents. George Washington had only ran for 2 terms and was president for a total of 8 years. Every president following this would agree with what he did and only be in office for 8 years. The only president to ever run or be in office for more than 2 terms was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who was president for 4 terms. This is because he deeply believed that it was important to have the same president throughout World War II, rather than having to go through a transition of power during such a grave time. Once Franklin D. Roosevelt would pass away in office, the 22nd Amendment was passed in 1951, legally limiting the number of terms to 2. What states have term limits? Some state governments also have term limits for their offices. State term limits experiences provide context for some congressional proposals. According to the National Conference of State Legislatives, 15 states currently limit state legislatives. These limits vary significantly. This is a quote from Garrett. Now, in Ohio, in our own state, we have term limits for our Senate and our House, each of which are 8 years long. In California, it's 12 years for their House of Representatives and Senate, and in Arkansas, it's 16 years for their state and House, meaning the times do, in fact, vary greatly from 8 to almost being over double that. Criticisms of U.S. term limits. One of the criticisms that U.S. term limits have, or at least the lack of term limits in the United States, is that representatives are too old. The lack of term limits for the other parts of the government, United States, has faced criticism. One of those is that once someone gets old enough, they are able to stay in office, but won't be in the condition to do a good job. Over the past year, the Republican leader of the Senate, or the minority leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, would become silent during press meetings. He would do this twice. This would raise concerns about how he's doing and if he can still hold office. He's also fallen at his own house and needed medical assistance. People believe that if Mitch McConnell isn't healthy enough to actually effectively run the Republican Party in the Senate, that he shouldn't have that position of power and should be at home with his family instead. And then here is a image from the press meeting that Mitch McConnell froze up at. Here's a quote from Call about people's public perception and and if they do think that we should have more term limits in the United States. Public consultation survey of 2,700 registered voters was conducted by the Program for Public Consultation, the PPC, at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. Passing a constitutional amendment to establish terms in Congress was favored by 83% of registered voters nationally, with little difference between partisans. 86% of Republicans, 80% of Democrats, and 84% of independents. This means that people are very open to the idea of having term limits for Congress. Another criticism of the term limits in the United States is that the Supreme Court is a for-life position. This leads to people being in the Supreme Court for a very long time. The age range of, or at least the time that a Supreme Court has been in office, ranges from the early 90s, mid 2000s, and to the last 8 years. Currently, the oldest member of the Supreme Court is Clarence Thomas, who has been a justice since October 23rd, 1991. Solutions to America's term limits. The most straightforward solution. The most straightforward solution to this problem would be to add a flat 8-year term limit to the Senate, House of Representatives, and the Supreme Court. This would put them on the same level as the president and would add checks and balances to the government. The only issue with this is that, according to Cantolini's research into the ISC, the Indian Supreme Court, shows that a shorter justice term is correlated with a more unstable country. Short tenure of judges on the ISC, as well as other design features of the ISC, contributes to doctoral instability. The time ISC judges spend on the court has decreased over the years. Gadabois, an early commentator of the court in 1969, noted the average tenure of the Supreme Court judges to be 6.6 years. From 1985 to 2010, it was 6 years. I see judges who were appointed on or after April 2010 and who retired. This quote shows that the shorter amount of time that a justice is in office, the more likely it is that the country's unstable. So if we can't do an 8-year term for the Supreme Court of Justice, then what should be an appropriate amount? A good age range I found from Colosso was 24 years. A lot of advantages of these is that this would give a justice a definite end date to their term, rather than them having to be put on a death watch, which is essentially when a justice gets too old to effectively do their job, but they're still alive enough to be able to perform their duties. And it leads to that iffy, will the president have to pick someone new, or will they be able to hold out for longer? This also makes for a smoother transition from one justice to another, because we'll know, oh, this Supreme Court, this justice is available from this year all the way to this year. At the end of their term, they'll switch out and the president knows when to pick, and the person also knows when their time is up. In summary, term limits should be in more parts of the United States government. The people are for it, and it's unfair to have someone that's too old to effectively do their job still be in office. State government term limits exist and work for them. We can see that they work in Ohio, California, and Arkansas. And it's important to craft a term limit that works for each branch. Rather than just having a one-size-fits-all, it's important to know the kind of work that the branch does and the kind of term limit that they should have. And here are my sources, and